Rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuhu.
If you want to get closer, you can use the APS-C setting on there. But
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حقا قدر مقدار العظيم أما بعد الحمد لله رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah that all of us were here today in Rumi's cave. Alhamdulillah for this really special delight that we have. We have Professor Joseph Hill, who is a professor from the University of Alberta, and we are very excited to have him here doing this lecture, important lecture on women who are men, the women spiritual guides in Senegal. And even someone actually said to me, this is really exciting because in many tariqas, you don't hear about women leadership, women that are scholars and that are Muqaddams and have males who they are guiding. You don't hear a lot about this, but in the tariqa Tijaniyya, this is very common. And mashallah, Professor Joseph Hill is very exciting and you're going to enjoy him. But one of the things that I find so fabulous about him is that, like, okay, he's fluent, he speaks Arabic, but also he speaks Wolof, which is the language in Senegal. So basically, when he can, even me, I can go to Senegal and I have my sheikh there and I can get inside the culture, but he will go deeper inside the culture. And hopefully you even will talk a little bit about the linguistic, that even though the people of Senegal are excited about how deep his Wolof is. And then that's helped him actually to get really inside the culture. So I'm not don't say anything else because you're really in for a treat today, and I'm actually excited to listen myself. So Professor Joseph Hill.
thank you, Rakin. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm really happy to see such a good turnout and happy to see so many people are interested in this topic. And first I just want to thank everybody who's welcomed me so much. Rakin and Amina, Rokeya, Muhammad Yahya, Sakina, Munira, Babar, of course, who came and picked me up at the airport and has driven me around, and it's just been an amazing experience for me since I got here on Sunday. I'm here on my way to Medina Bay, inshallah, in Senegal, which is I think you'll see some pictures of Medina Bay in this presentation. Some of you are familiar with it. It's the center of the Faida Tijaniyya Sufi community. And it's where I've been doing research since about 2001. And I'll get into a little bit about the story of my research and my own personal story, inshallah. So I just wanted to thank everybody, first of all, for all the help. It's just been, and Sheikh Khalil, who's not here, also, and his wife, Ndey Astu, Aisha, have been incredibly generous. It's been an amazing experience for me being here during Ramadan with my good friends here, my brothers and sisters. As Brother Rakin said, I'm Joseph Hill. I teach at the University of Alberta in Canada, and I started research on Sufism in 2001. I was not a Muslim, I was not a Sufi, I had no personal interest in it whatsoever. I was just getting a PhD, and I thought this would be an interesting topic to study. I had no idea I was going to study women leaders either, because I didn't know they existed when I started my research. So I went to Medina Bay in 2001. Why did I go to Medina Bay? When I went there, everybody said, Alhamdulillah, Sheikh Ibrahim is so well known around the world that even Americans are coming here to do their PhD. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that, well, the reason was that I had read so much literature about Sufism in Senegal, but it was all about the Murid order, the Muridiyya. And I hadn't read anything about the Ibrahimiyya or the Faida Tijaniyya. Even though I knew it was a big group, I knew there were a lot of people who followed it, but I couldn't find a lot of scholarly work on the topic in Senegal. So that's why I went, because I knew that it was an important topic, but I couldn't find anybody else who was writing about it. So I went there and to do my dissertation research. I was doing dissertation research in the United States, and then I went to Senegal. And so I had a research assistant, and I told the research assistant, I want to interview Muqaddams, or representatives of the Sufi order, people who have been appointed to represent the Sufi order, to give the awrad or the adhkar of the Sufi order, And he said, okay, so he started listing people I should visit. First of all, you should visit the sons of Sheikh Ibrahim, who's the founder of the Faida. And then you can visit the people who they've appointed. And he started listing people, and one of the people he listed was a woman who lived a couple blocks away. And I said, what? There's a woman spiritual leader? Why haven't I never read about this anywhere else? Why has nobody ever told me this existed? And he said, and he just kind of shrugged his shoulder and said, yeah, it exists. And he said, there are probably more, but I don't really know. I don't really know who they are, but I know this one who lives just a few houses away. So we went to that leader, and her name was Jainaba Gay. Jainaba is a Senegalese pronunciation of the word of the name Zainabu. And she turned out to be just an amazingly generous woman who was just full of light, full of love. And she had a lot of disciples who would come to her house to receive tarbiyah, or to be, in other words, to be initiated into the process of knowing God. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, inshallah. And I asked her, in this context where pretty much people are only familiar with male religious leaders, the idea of a woman Islamic leader, I had never heard of it before, and most of the people I talked to had never heard of it either. So I said, in this context where women haven't traditionally done this, has anyone opposed you acting as a religious leader? And she said, no. Assalamu alaikum. What happened? She said, well, a few people who are not from the Faida community have opposed her and said, women shouldn't do this, women should just cook and clean and take care of children, that's it. But she said, within the Faida community, nobody has ever opposed her. And she said, on the contrary, she had a very close relationship with Sheikh Ibrahim Nias, the founder of the Faida. She had a very close relationship with his sons and daughters. And when young people needed tarbiyah, they would sometimes send them to her for tarbiyah. So she was very well respected, and at first I thought she must be very marginalized in this community, but as I asked around, everybody seemed to have a lot of respect for her and to say that she was a very legitimate, very good leader. And she had whenever I went to her house, she had a lot of young people who were there to receive spiritual instruction. So that kind of surprised me. It surprised me not only that women were acting as leaders, but that these women were not marginalized at all. That there was no controversy. Nobody actually had to call a meeting and say, should we appoint women as leaders, yes or no? They just they did it. But as I researched this more, I kind of decided by the end of my dissertation research, that I probably had enough information for an article about this. So I started writing an article, but then I realized that this article, as I started talking to people about this, it was something that went beyond an article. I had enough material because I had interviewed several others in addition to her. I had enough material that I probably could publish more than an article, so I started developing that into a book. And so in 2009, I started writing an article. I went back to Senegal, did more research, interviewed more, and then I realized there were a lot more women than I had known, that I was familiar with, and I really had to do some digging to find them, because some people were a little bit hesitant to talk about the women leaders, because they weren't really sure if these women should be called out into the public like that, because they should be kind of left sort of hidden. So I had to do a lot of digging to find out all the women who were leaders, but as I dug deeper and deeper, I discovered that there were a lot more than I had guessed, and I ended up interviewing about 25 women leaders, and I'm sure there were a lot more. These are just the ones that I happened to find. So that expanded into a book, and then it expanded into 2 books. So I have one book that's supposed to be, that inshallah they're going to give me final word on whether it's been accepted or not, and it's called Wrapping Authority, and I'll talk about the wide wrapping authority in a minute. And then I have another book that's kind of spun off of that one, that has some of the stuff that just wouldn't fit in it because it was just getting too long. And that one I provisionally entitled that the second book, Women Who Are Men, the emergence of women's leadership in a Sufi movement in Senegal. When I came here today, we talked about the fact that this could lead to some confusion, because nowadays when you say women who are men, people start thinking of all kinds of LGBTQ issues and so on. So people might look at that and say, what is this book about? But I'll explain why this title. Hopefully I'll have time to explain all of this. And this talk is going to be pretty informal. This is a lot more informal than I'm used to. I'm used to getting up and reading papers at academic conferences, so I'm going to explain my research, and then I want some of the time to be open to questions, because I'm sure you all have questions that I haven't really foreseen in in my presentation, but I'm just going to kind of summarize this in as, you know, in terms that I think are relevant to the current audience rather than the academic conferences that I'm used to talking to. So just to give a little background, before I get into the findings of my research, which spread from 2001 till the present, this is ongoing research, but I mostly have studied the question of women authorities since 2009 to the present. So in Senegal, some of you are familiar with this already background that you know, but in Senegal, about 95% of the population is Muslim, Sunni Muslim. And they follow, for the most part, the Maliki madhab. Within those 95% of the whole population, about 90% subscribe to some kind of Sufi order. And you might say, whoa, that's a lot of Sufis. Well, it is, but the majority of Senegalese, you know, they'll say, yeah, my sheikh is this sheikh or that sheikh, Haj Malik Si of the Tijaniya, Sheikh Ibrahim Niass of the Tijaniya also. You might have heard of Ahmadu Bamba of the Muridiya, who founded his own Senegalese order. You might have heard of the Layen, which some people call it a Sufi order. Some people say, well, it doesn't have the characteristics of Sufi. I call it a Sufi order just because it kind of comes from that same tradition. There's the Qadiri, that was the first Sufi order there. And but the caveat, what you have to keep in mind is that although 90% of Senegalese say, yeah, I'm Tijani, I'm Murid, I'm whatever, most of them don't necessarily participate in Sufism in the way that you would think a Sufi participate. In other words, they don't necessarily do the adhkar that a Sufi would do. Most of the time when somebody says, I follow the sheikh, it means that they consider that person to be their sheikh, and they go to them maybe to have them pray for them. They want to get their barakah, but they don't necessarily have any daily Sufi practice that they do. So there are all different levels of participation. And what was unique about Sheikh Ibrahim Niass in his context was that he said, my disciples, I don't want my disciples just to come to me to get barakah from me, to get divine blessing. I want my disciples to know God. And I want my disciples to be very observant Muslims, to pray 5 times a day, which was not really exacted. Some of the other groups didn't necessarily require that you pray 5 times a day. He wanted everybody to follow Sharia, and he also wanted people to seek something called haqiqah, which is the divine truth behind the Sharia, behind the visible and the articulable side of Islam. So what was unique with Sheikh Ibrahim, among many other things, but what usually people talk about, is something called tarbiyah. He didn't invent the idea of tarbiyah. It existed for a long time in Sufism, but his version of tarbiyah was a little bit different in the sense that he promised that anyone who came to him and became his disciple would know God he would make it easy to know God, to attain what's called ma'arifi billah, or the fath, or the opening, the knowledge of God, or the opening, the spiritual opening through which you can intuit the presence of God in everything. So anybody who's been through tarbiyah would say that I'm not going to get into too many details about what people say in tarbiyah, because people articulate all kinds of things about the experience that they can't really put into words. But in short, people experience usually after maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, sometimes longer, sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes 1 hour a day. It really depends on the person. People say that they experience fana and nafs, the self, the nafs, kind of recedes into the background, disappears, and all they're aware of is the existence of God, of Allah, in everything. So this movement spread around the region that Sheikh Ibrahim was from, kind of south of Dakar, the area around Kaolack. But because he was the junior member of his family, other parts of Senegal were all controlled by very powerful Sufi leaders. His movement for a long time didn't really get beyond his little homeland around Kaolack. In Senegal, he got hundreds of millions of followers around the rest of West Africa, but within Senegal, he only had a small number of followers until maybe around the 1990s, when there was a huge urbanization of youth from the countryside. And these youth, a lot of them came kind of being disjointed from their families and from their traditions, and they didn't have really a good means of income. They didn't have a strong sense of community where they were coming. And so they had a lot of questions. And since around the 1990s, and especially around 2000, this movement, the Faida movement, And the idea of knowing God, the idea that you can personally not just go to a sheikh and have them bless you and pray for you, but you can go and you can actually know God and have a direct connection with Allah. That you can actually, people who, I've talked to many poets, many rappers, that my current project is on rappers, who say that since they went through tarbiyah, they have this direct connection with Allah, and their lyrics are not the same. That their lyrics come through inspiration. They don't even have to sit and think about their lyrics anymore. They just come. So people kind of see this as a direct channel of inspiration. It became extremely popular since around 2000. That's around the time when I began my research. And during the same period, we've seen a huge rise in female leadership. So this is Dakar, the capital of Senegal. I don't know if you can see the little pointer there. I've put little crescents where some of the major centers of Sufi leadership are in Senegal. So in Yoff, which is kind of part of the Dakar area, you have the Lion Order. That's the center of their order. Tiwaawan, right here, we have the center of the larger branch of the Tijani within Senegal. Within the world it's not, but within Senegal it's a larger branch. And then to the east we have Touba, the center of the Murids. And then here in Kaolack, we have Laona Niassène, which is where Sheikh Ibrahim's family was from. Well, that's where his father established a Zawiya. And then when he became independent from his family, he established a Zawiya in a place called Medina Bay. In actual space, it's not that far north, but in order to see the difference between Laona and Niassène, I had to put a little further north. So he established Medina Bay around 1930. Different accounts say different things, but the written account suggests 1932. And then he was born in Taïba Niassène, which is a huge pilgrimage center now. So that's just to give you an idea of the spatiality of this. And his family was mostly, since the 19th century, they lived in Saloum. And then this, for a long time, was the center of the Faida movement. Almost all Senegalese Faida followers were here. There were a few up here in Jolof, but most of them were here. But since about 2000, the vast majority of Faida followers in Senegal are in Dakar, probably, because that's where most of the young people are. It's become a huge youth movement. So this is the mosque in Medina Bay. Some of you have been there and have seen this mosque. And this is the mausoleum of Sheikh Ibrahim, where he and some of his sons and close disciples are buried now. I think I photographed that in 2010 probably. After the major renovations. It looked very different before then. And then, so this is a picture that I took in Dakar. You can't tell it's Dakar because the same thing could be anywhere. This is just to give you an idea when they get together to do the Friday dhikr, or the Hadr al-Jumu'ah. This is in the house of Sheikh Ibrahim in Dakar. So this is the men's section, and then this is the women's section in the courtyard in the back. They're doing construction there now, so there's a lot of, this was last year. They're doing a lot of, no, maybe it was 2014, I don't know. So there's a lot of gravel and things. They're expanding the house. So you can see, one particular thing about the Faida about Sheikh Ibrahim is from the very beginning. Now there have been a lot of changes since 2000, but those changes are all rooted in things that came before. It's not like people suddenly said, hey, maybe we should involve women. So from the very beginning, Sheikh Ibrahim, the Tijaniya in Senegal, not necessarily outside of Senegal, but within Senegal, it had been a boys' club. And they hadn't really involved women. They had assumed that it was only for the men. That's not the way it was designed from the beginning. There had been female Muqaddamas, or spiritual guides, from the beginning of the Tijaniya, but in Senegal they just kind of assumed that it was only for the men. So when Sheikh Ibrahim started the Faida, his first few disciples apparently were men, and then their wives and relatives and his own mother said, hey, what's this stuff about knowing God? How can I take part in that, or should I just do my 5 prayers and not worry about that? So some of them went to his companion Sheikh Ibrafal, who's not the same as the Ahmad Obama's disciple Sheikh Ibrafal, who's the founder of the Baifals. And they said, hey, what's this knowing God stuff we're hearing about? We want to know God too. We want tarbiyah too. And so Ibrafal went to Sheikh Ibrahim and said, hey, the women are saying that they want to know God too. Is that a possibility? And Sheikh Ibrahim said, and some of them said, no, of course not. And Sheikh Ibrahim said, yeah, there's no reason why women can't know God. They can know all the same thing that men can know. So he said, Sheikh Ibrafal, I want you to give tarbiyah to the women. So at the beginning, he gave tarbiyah to the women. And according to his sons that I interviewed, the very soon, there were twice as many women as there were men in the Faida movement. Partly this could be because it was a polygamous society, so most men had, most of Sheikh Ibrahim's followers, even though they were very young men, several of them already had 2 wives. Sheikh Ibrahim himself, I think, had at least 2 wives at that time, and then his mother went through Tarbiyah too. His mother was one of his strongest supporters throughout his life, Mama Stujanka, and throughout her life, I mean. And she was one of the first people to go through the process of Tarbiyah and have this experience of annihilation of the self. And once he reached twice as many disciples as Sheikh Ibrahim, he came back to Sheikh Ibrahim and said, because I don't want to rival you, and this goes back to a point of fiqh that can be contended, he said, because a woman's weight in testimony in court is half the weight of a man, I would consider that if I have twice as many followers, if I initiate twice as many people as my sheikh, then I will be trying to outdo him. So he said, I'll stop for now. But after that, it seems that for a while he stopped, but then he started again, and then Sheikh Ibrahim started giving tarbiyah to women, and then his closest follower, Sayyidi Ali Usise, started giving tarbiyah, because most of the time when people came to Sheikh Ibrahim for tarbiyah, he would send them to Sayyidi Ali Usise. He would say, he's your sheikh, go to him and have him give you tarbiyah. So, and then I know many women who got their tarbiyah from both Sheikh Ibrahim and from Sayyidi Ali Sise. So in the beginning days, I interviewed a lot of older women who were part of this community at the beginning. Some of them said that their husbands didn't want them to get tarbiyah. Like one of them, I wrote about this in my dissertation many years ago, 10 years ago. One of them said that she heard people talking about the Sheikh Ibrahim who was in the village of Kosi outside of Kaulak. And she suddenly, just something entered her. She had to go get tarbiyah. And this village was, several miles away. They didn't have cars, and she didn't have a horse cart to get her there, and she didn't even know where it was, really. She knew she had to go, so she asked her husband, can I go to Sheikh Ibrahim? And her husband said, of course not. So then one day, she was out early in the morning, and she saw these guys, and she just said, I have to go to Kosi and get tarbiyah. So she saw these men walking by, and she said, and she started walking and on the path outside the village, and she asked the men, do you know where Kosi is? And they said, yeah, that's where we're going right now. We'll take you there. So they took her. So she sneaked out of her village against her husband's permission. And some people would say this goes against Sharia. And nowadays she fully admits this goes against Sharia, but sometimes if God is calling you, God is above your husband. Allah is, His command is the highest command, and if your husband forbids you from doing God's command, then you have to go against your husband. So she went to Kosi, and she received tarbiyah from him, and then she went back to her village, and her whole family then received tarbiyah, and the faidah spread to that village, and they all became very close adherents. And then she started organizing these dhikr ceremonies in her village. There was another village where 4 women during the early period of the faidah were appointed by Sheikh Ibrahim himself as muqaddamas, or spiritual guides. And the villagers, some of the elders in the village, told me that these women would give tarbiyah to the women in the village. Later, when I went back, they actually changed their story, and they said, oh no, they weren't actually muqaddams, they were just kind of women who were very dedicated. But I kind of wondered, why did all the elders tell me that they were muqaddams, and then later they decided they weren't muqaddams? And I think it has to do with, my only conclusion I can think of is it has to do with the idea of the idea of kind of what they call in Wallaf sutura, which is like protecting women's decency, not putting women out into the public whenever you don't have to. So it's not about keeping them down and not admitting that women can be powerful. It's about not bringing them out into the public. It's kind of like unveiling them in public. So people in this village kind of had this sense that talking about them to a foreign researcher would be to unveil their women publicly, and they weren't quite sure about that. That was my guess, but they unanimously agreed that these were muqaddams, and that they were leaders of women, given women tarbiyah before. So this has existed for a long time, but it's been under the radar. People don't want to talk about it because it has to do with unveiling women to talk about it too much. They're not really sure about talking about women too much in public. Now, I've kind of, in my research, I've divided the women I'm studying kind of into 2 main categories, because there's what you can call the old muqaddamas and the new muqaddamas. And this doesn't have to do with age, it has to do with category, it has to do with which category was there first. So well, I'm not sure if I call them old muqaddamas, but just kind of muqaddamas in the traditional Tijaniyah. Most of them were like Sheikh Ibrahim's daughters. He appointed, during his lifetime, any of his daughters that attained maturity and attained a certain level of knowledge, and all his daughters that were raised by him and I believe all his daughters that were even after he passed away memorized the Quran and studied the Islamic sciences. So he insisted that all his daughters study the same things that his sons were studying. The only difference was that when his sons got older, he sent them to Al-Azhar to study in Egypt. But his daughters, there's this notion that the daughters have to be more protected and shouldn't be sent out to travel as much. So he kept the daughters, and he had them continue their studies in Medina Bay. He always said that you can learn all the same things. You can learn anything you want in Medina Bay. He had all the knowledge. I mean, before he was 30 years old, without any formal study himself, he had memorized all the books of fiqh and all the, he knew all the books of Sufism and all the different disciplines. So he wasn't convinced that you would get something more by studying in Al-Azhar than you would get from studying in Medina Bay, but he wanted his sons to be more cosmopolitan, have some experience abroad. So he sent them to Al-Azhar, and there they were able to establish relationships with people around the Muslim world. So that was their job. The girls he kept at home, and he had educated them himself, and his close disciples educated them, and they all memorized the Quran. So these are two of his daughters. This is Ndey Aida, who is named after. The way names work in Wolof is kind of complicated, but Ndey Aida actually means Aisha, and she's named after her grandmother, Mam Astu Janka. Astu Aida, they don't sound the same, but it's the same name. And the one on the right there is Nafisatu, who also has memorized the Quran and is a Muqaddama and has her own disciples, and she has lots of. Her house is always full of Nigerians, who are students who are there to study there. So the older Muqaddamas, generally they follow a pattern. Most of them are the daughters or the wives of major religious leaders. Most of them only exercise authority. If they do exercise authority, they might be appointed as a Muqaddama or a spiritual guide, but not really exercise authority because they don't want to rival the men in their family or whatever. Or they might only just act as leaders of women in segregated spaces. This is something we've seen all over the world. And there's a group in Saudi Arabia, in Medina, where there's a famous Muqaddama there. I'm forgetting her name. You probably remember it. But there's a whole there are generations of female spiritual guides in Medina and Munawwara in Saudi Arabia who have been leaders of women in segregated spaces. And the reason why they need to be appointed is to maintain that segregation, so that women aren't comfortable necessarily going to a man and asking them for guidance, so they might be a lot more comfortable going to a woman. So they appointed women who were very spiritually powerful women who led women. But there's a category that I call the new Muqaddamas that I've only seen, and tell me if you know of examples. I've seen a few examples that are kind of similar, but really as a whole phenomenon, I've only seen it in Senegal among this particular group. The new Muqaddamas, of whom here's one example, Ndeye Maguette Niang, Dakar. What makes them unique is that they have male and female disciples. In other words, nobody actually says, they'll say they're their disciples, but ultimately they're disciples of Sheikh Ibrahim. But they will give the wird or the adhkar, the dhikr of Tijaniya, and they'll also give the tarbiyah to male and female disciples. And the other thing that's particular about them is that none of them are daughters or wives of religious leaders. They've all come into this through their own path. They've all most of them were not born into the Faida. Most of them were born into other Sufi groups. Some of them went through Salafi groups in their lives. Some of them went through the Murid. Some of them were born as Murids, members of the Muridiyya order or other Tijaniya groups. And some of them went through several groups before ending up in the Faida. And then they proved themselves to be very dedicated disciples with a good level of spiritual knowledge. And you might say, well, they must be very marginal. They must not really be the respected leaders. But most of them hold appointments from the sons of Sheikh Ibrahim or other very prominent people. So they have the stamp of approval from the most central leaders in the Faida. Most of them have not studied Arabic. Most of them know really the points of fiqh. They know the very particular points of how to pray and to fast. They know all the rules that you would have learned through studying text, but they haven't studied the text themselves. And most of them do have very close relationships with ulama, people who have studied, who can give the more textual side of things. Here's another woman that was appointed by Sheikh Ibrahim, Astou Souare. She was the wife of one of his well-known disciples in Rufisque, a town outside Senegal. But it took me some research to find out that she existed, because even her husband is a little bit and the people around her are a little bit hesitant to talk about her appointment because they weren't sure if it was really, if women need to be discussed in public like that. So I'll talk a little bit about the first category of Muqaddamas, and this category mostly in my research has included the daughters of Sheikh Ibrahim. This is one of Sheikh Ibrahim's oldest daughters, Sayyida Ruqayya. She is a very well-known Quran teacher. She has a Quran school in Medina Bay, in Kaulak. And one of her claims to fame is, first, she was the first woman, maybe the only woman, to speak publicly in the Mawlid in Medina Bay during the life of Sheikh Ibrahim. He would ask her, while she was a student, to get up and give a talk in the Mawlid. And this has not happened very much since then. But every year, she usually gives some speech either within the Mawlid or during the conference before the Mawlid or sometime during that period in the main square of Medina Bay. Her other claim to fame is that she was possibly, she was one of the first women, aside from Nana Asma'u in Nigeria over 100 years ago, she was possibly the first modern woman in West Africa to write books in Arabic. She wrote a book called Hadd al-Mar'a fil Islam, the lot or the position of women in Islam. She wrote a book called Tanbih al-Banat, Tanbih al-Bint al-Muslima. In other words, kind of counsels to Muslim girls. She wrote another book for children. These are mostly books that were, well, the latter books were to be used in schools. It was actually, they were encouraged by Kwame Nkrumah and his Department of Education. They wanted to introduce Islamic learning into their schools, and so she was the best authority they could find on educating children in Ghana at the time. And so the Ghanaian government asked her to write these books. And then she wrote Hadd al-Mar'a fil Islam, which is not for a pedagogical book for children, it's for anybody to know about the state of women in Islam. And she wrote that in 1975. The other ones she wrote around 1968, I think. This is her in the tomb of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, praying for disciples. The other really well-known, there are many other ones throughout West Africa, but most of Sheikh Ibrahim's daughters married Muqaddams. They married his followers in other countries in West Africa, so they live all throughout West Africa, Nigeria, Mauritania, Niger. This is one of the ones who stayed in Senegal, like Ruqayya. Her name is Sheikha Mariam, and she is maybe his best-known daughter in Senegal, because she, and arguably she could be the most influential and most highly respected Faida leader in Dakar of all the leaders, because she's the senior leader of the Faida in Dakar, and she's been there by far the longest time. She married and moved to Dakar in 1952. When she was about 20 years old, she moved to Dakar. Very soon after moving to Dakar, she started, because she had memorized the Quran, and not only did she memorize the Quran, but Sheikh Ibrahim wanted his children to memorize the Quran not according to the Wolof pronunciation, but according to the original Arabic pronunciation. So he brought teachers from Mauritania to teach them how to recite the Quran in the original Arabic pronunciation, because the Wolof pronunciation tends to be very simplified. Many letters are pronounced just like sa. But he brought in Mauritanians who are really, really good at the tajweed, or the very detailed Arabic pronunciation. So he brought, the original one is, I always get them mixed up, Ahmed or Abdullah Rabbani, I think was the original one, right? And then his son Ahmed, from Mauritania to teach the Quran. So she learned this really, really pure Arabic pronunciation. So when she came to Dakar, her husband asked her, hey, why don't you teach some of the children from my house the Quran? He had another wife who had other children, so there were already children in the house. So she said, okay, I'll teach the Quran. So she started teaching the Quran, and people in the neighborhood started saying, hey, these kids are really reciting the Quran really well. So the neighbors started sending kids. And then she went on tour with her father through Africa and the Middle East, and people from all those countries heard her students reciting the Quran, and they said, hey, we want our children to learn the Quran that way. So she started getting hundreds of children from Nigeria, from Mauritania even, where that teaching originated, from Ghana, from every West African country, even from some Arab countries. So she started teaching them the Quran, and she became a worldwide figure, and there have been documentaries about her on Al Jazeera and so forth. She started getting financial support from some of the Gulf countries to build a Quranic institute. So this is her praying for disciples who have come before their exams. These are university students who have come before their exams, to have her pray for them, for a Hadrat al-Jum'ah, they're doing a dhikr at her house. These are some of her, when I was there, she wanted me to hear some of her students reciting, so she called some of these students up from downstairs to her room to recite. Some of these are daughters of her brothers, they're grandchildren of Sheikh Ibrahim. Some of them are just children entrusted to her. And then this is her Islamic Institute. These are students at her Islamic Institute in Dakar. And then she has, aside from this big Islamic Institute, which is like all the way, elementary school through high school, she has several Quranic schools where people that she's trained to teach the Quran teach, and then she will make her rounds and go to each of the schools and test everybody's knowledge and make sure everybody's learning. She's about 85 now. I don't know how much of the rounds she still makes, but is that one still going over there? I think the battery. What's that? Oh, was it? Oh, okay. Yeah, it's hard to tell from here. So I'm not sure how much of the rounds she still makes, but she still, when I go and visit her in Dakar today, she'll still say, call up, so-and-so. I want to hear their pronunciation. And if the kid pronounces something wrong, she'll say, no, it's not da, it's wa. Or it's not, sa, it's not sa, it's sa. She'll correct people. And she has a very good knowledge of fiqh and other matters of Islamic learning. One thing that I've noticed is universal among these women. And the reason why I called this talk Women Who Are Men. This is a title that whenever people hear it, they go, what are you talking about? It's because when the women are... the big question I had in my mind was when I started this research, all right, like I said, women are not usually known in this area to be Quran teachers. Quranic teaching has always been the domain of men. And this is the same with Sufi leadership. Being a Muqaddam was always something that men did. Being a spiritual guide was something that men did. So my main question over the past few years has been, how have women come into these positions without anybody really questioning them, without anybody saying, hey, you can't do that? How is it that this is a pretty radical change, really. It's a pretty radical change where you had pretty much 0 women doing this to a lot of women doing it. How is it that nobody has really questioned that, or there's not been any controversy? And the short answer that I have to that question, which can then branch out into a lot of different things. So my whole book is about this question. The short answer to that is that they're using kind of metaphors to present Islamic leadership. Well, there are three things that they claim that sound totally contradictory, but that really come together. So, one, they claim that, women are natural leaders. Women are natural. I mean, in the West, we're not that surprised, because if you go to kindergartens, most of the kindergarten teachers are women. The Quranic school is essentially the kindergarten of the Muslim world. I mean, it's young kids who are studying there. So now, why it took so long to see this kind of natural connection? If women are the ones in charge of children, there's the saying, madrasa al-ula fil haya. The woman is the first school in life. So why didn't people make the connection between that and Quranic schooling? Well, she does. She makes the connection. She, if you ask her, why can you teach Quranic, teach the Quran when women couldn't do that before? One of her answers is, it's because I'm a mother. And she surrounds herself with children all the time. If you look at this picture, this one happens to have her own descendants in it, but the kid on the right is a kid she adopted. He was brought to her as a baby. He hadn't even been named. He hadn't had his haqiqah yet. He hadn't been named as a child yet. Tiny baby from Mauritania. She herself did the naming ceremony, slaughtered the sheep, and gave him a name herself. She has another kid in some of the... Is he in the other pictures? I might have another... No, I don't have that picture in here. There's another kid from Nigeria who was sent a Hausa kid, who she pretty much adopted. She did the same thing. And he's always around her. So she's surrounded by these kids. And she tells me when she'll be driving around town, she sees these kids playing in the street, doing nothing, street children, whatever. She'll get out of her car. She'll go to the kids' parents and say, hey, these kids aren't being educated properly. Will you give me your kids and I'll raise them for you? And so they'll say, okay. So she takes their kids, she puts them in her Quranic school, they live there. She feeds them, she clothes them every age, she buys them a pair of clothing that's tailored to them. She has a tailoring operation in her house. that she pays for them to do these clothes. So she takes many of the kids around her don't know any parent other than her. She is the mom. They call her mother. Her nickname is Yai Boy, which means mommy, essentially. And that's what all the people around her, even adults, doesn't matter what age you are, you call her mommy. So this is one of the things that so this is a three-pronged strategy of kind of normalizing women's authority. One is to emphasize the femininity, emphasize the aspects that are traditionally feminine. One is motherhood, one is cooking. I have a lot of stories about how cooking is a really big, important part of being a woman in Senegal. So if your major experience in life has to do with mothering and cooking, now if you're a liberal feminist, you'll probably say, all right, if I want to be like the boys, I'm going to get as far away from mothering and cooking as I can. I'm going to say, I'm going to stay away from the kitchen, I'm going to stay away from the kids, because as soon as I do that, they're going to think I'm a lowly woman. But if all your experience is life, and many parts of your experience in life is cooking and taking care of children, cooking has a very profound religious significance for members of the Faida in Senegal. They organize big events, and they don't cook and say, here's the food, eat it and go. The food is actually a ritual activity. Presenting food is a ritual activity that brings barakah, that brings thawab from Allah. So I knew many women who would cook plates, dishes. First of all, they do all their homework. They become a good disciple. They'd gather people around them, because they were many of them were in a neighborhood. I'll show you one in a while who was in a neighborhood where the disciples were disorganized. There were a lot of young people who wanted tarbiyah. They couldn't find anybody to give it to them. She organized them all into a daira. And she said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cook a big meal. We're going to take it to the sons of Sheikh Ibrahim and say, here's what we're doing. We're forming a daira. Here's the meal. So she brought them the meal, and it was the meal that kind of caught their attention and said, wait, this is our devotional, this is our offering to Allah. This is the sign of our discipleship. And soon after that, they gave her an ijaza to act as a muqaddama. But Sheikh Maryam here, I want to talk about her as a mother. That's how she kind of established herself as a leader. But then the second prong approach. So the one is emphasizing femininity. The second one is something that is again very controversial if you're talking to liberal feminists, saying we are men. We have attained the status of men, and that might make you go, whoa, you mean you have to become a man to be anything in life? Well, not really. I mean, if you're emphasizing motherhood and parenthood and cooking and all these other feminine things, then clearly you're not afraid of being a woman. But here they're drawing on this metaphor that goes way back to the beginnings of Sufism. Fariduddin al-Attar, when he was writing the biographies of the saints, he wrote about Rabi al-Adawiyya, the famous Sufi woman of his time. And she actually did flee from womanhood. She didn't marry. She didn't have children. I don't know if she ever cooked anything, but it never talks about her cooking anything. She essentially attained the status of an honorary man. So ever since then, they've talked about her as an honorary man. And there have been many women who have been spoken of as men. And Sheikh Ibrahim, in one of his poems, said, وَلَيْسَ كُلَّ مَجْلُوبٍ بِذَاكِ الْعَارِفِ بل الذي بقى بعد الفناء وسلك ونهر الرسول سلك. And then something like, I might be getting the Arabic wrong, هذا هو الرجل أنثى أو ذكر. So he says, Sheikh Ibrahim says, he uses the same metaphor. You can find this all through the history of Sufism. What is the man? The man is the one who attains a high degree of knowledge. Now you could interpret that as saying, okay, only men attain a high degree of knowledge. But you could also interpret that as if somebody says, hey, this is only for the men. You can interpret that as saying, okay, it's only for the men, but our definition of men will be everybody who's attained a high degree of knowledge, and you're not a man if you haven't. So this is a different definition of men. And of course, according to the liberal definition, this is not going to fly. But according to all the women leaders that I interviewed, they use this. Every single one of them used this. They said, yes, we're mothers, we are cooks, we are whatever, we obey our husbands even. But we are men too. Which sounds very paradoxical. But what they mean is, from a spiritual standpoint, there's no difference between them and other men, and anyone else, any man, and there's no reason why they should occupy a spiritual state lower than any other man. The third prong that they use in their strategy, which again sounds contradictory if you don't understand the context, but hopefully you'll understand a little bit of the context after this presentation. The third strategy is to say that gender doesn't exist at all, that male female doesn't exist, because once you attain a knowledge of Allah, he transcends gender. We use that pronoun because we can't talk about sentient beings without using he or she in English. But Allah transcends gender. So once you actually get to a knowledge of God, then the male and female no longer exist at all. So we have these three. We have emphasizing femininity, which every single one of the leaders that I interviewed did. We have claiming an honorary male status, which all of them did. And we also have transcending gender altogether. Man, woman doesn't even matter once you reach a stage where you're transcending gender. And all of them used all three of the status, no matter what, all three of these arguments, no matter what their social status or their background, they use those same kind of reasoning. So that's the first category, the daughters of Sheikh Ibrahim and in some cases other leaders. The second category of Muqaddimah that I want to talk about, or leader that I want to talk about, is what I call the new Muqaddimas, or the new spiritual guides. And these are women who, this is a phenomenon, and it also applies to men too. I'm mostly talking about the women, but it applies to men too. In this day and age where the word faida means the flood. It means or an effusion, a flooding, an outpouring. And the way adherents of the faida movement or community understand this is that this is something that where at any given time, the faida might not exist at any given time, but very suddenly the floodgates will open and a whole bunch of people will come in. And when all those people come in, where do they all go? Sometimes, people can actually go to Imam Sheikh in Medina Bay and get tarbiyah or whatever from him. But in Senegal, there are so many hundreds of thousands, or so many thousands of people coming in, that not all of them can manage to get to Medina Bay to get their tarbiyah. Some of them just stay in Dakar and go with somebody in their neighborhood. So what's happened is that many people have been appointed muqaddams, spiritual guides, who have no formal training. And you might say they don't know what they're doing, but they're constantly in contact with other people at all times. They're not just kind of off on their own doing their own thing. So they don't have a lot of formal training, but they have a lot of experiential knowledge. And so if they prove that experiential knowledge to some of the sons or daughters of Sheikh Ibrahim or other major leaders of the movement, they'll appoint them as muqaddams to take care of the disciples in their neighborhood. This is the first one that I know of who fits into this category. She was appointed in 1980, long time ago. Way before the whole Muqaddimah thing became a widespread thing. Her name is Jaran Jai. Her parents are Talibai or Faida people. At a certain moment in her life, she just became very devoted to tasawwuf, to the Faida, to knowing God. And she had a relative who was married to Jarno Hassan Dem, who was one of Sheikh Ibrahim's main followers in Medina Bay from the Halpular, from the Mauritanian part of the river valley, Senegal River Valley. And she was visiting him with him, and she would go and visit him, and she would talk to him. And one time, she hadn't seen him in a while, she went and visited him, and he said, I've been holding on to this for you for 6 months. I have an ijazah, a written ijazah as a muqaddimah. And he gave her that in 1980. She held on to it. She didn't do anything for a long time. She'd never heard of a woman being a guide. Nobody asked her. And what usually happens is, some of you know about this, when somebody is appointed as a muqaddam, they don't usually say, go and give tarbiyah and weird to as many people as you can. What they usually say is, don't breathe a word of this to anybody. And when the time comes, Allah will make that known to you. So she held on to that for over 10 years until a group of young people, 6 young teenagers came to her. They were all brothers and sisters. And they heard her talking about Allah, and they said, whoa, we want to know about this. And they said, can you give us this knowledge? And she took that as her sign to give them knowledge. That was in the mid-1990s. So she started giving tarbiyah. So she was the first woman to give tarbiyah in Dakar, I think. Sheikh Maryam was a muqaddimah, but she didn't give tarbiyah until after her husband passed away. And that's not her specialty. So she was probably the first woman to give tarbiyah in Dakar, as far as I know. And then the next one was probably Awa Sise. This is her in the pink right here. She's sitting next to a granddaughter of Sheikh Ibrahim. I can't remember her name. She's a daughter of Sheikh Nadir, son of one of the senior sons of Sheikh Ibrahim. And her husband is the president of Ansaruddin, the Federation of Dairas in Dakar, right now. Now, even though he is administratively in a more visible position than her, he's the president of the association of all the disciples in Dakar. I don't think has ever given wird or tarbiyah. He's never actually given adhkar of Sufism. His wife, though, and she does not owe her position to him. She owes her position to her own story. She has ijazah. She was appointed by a son of Sayyidi Ali Sise, and also by who else? Son of Sheikh Ibrahim, I think. Sheikh Nadir, yeah. So she has her own daira. These are her followers who have. These are the members of her daira who she's given, most of them who she's given tarbiyah to. This is one of the most remarkable women leaders that I interviewed. She's a huge entrepreneur. And I have 2 chapters in my book where I talk extensively about her. Very interesting story that I can't talk about in detail here. But she went through this Salafi movement when she was married to a Salafi, and he kind of got her into Salafism. And while she was into Salafism, and she was a leading member of the Salafi movement in Senegal, and she would give speeches, and she became very learned in her own way. She didn't really study Arabic, but she learned it kind of just through studying in French and through listening to people. She became very learned about the questions of Sharia and stuff. And she started having these powerful spiritual experiences in which she felt that Sheikh Ibrahim was calling her to him. So she went to Medina Bay, and she visited the tomb of Sheikh Ibrahim, and she eventually went through tarbiyah. But she went through this 5-year period where she was very unsettled, and she couldn't, and eventually her husband divorced her, and she was just engrossed in kind of khalwa and doing dhikr all the time. And near the end of that period, she met a muqaddam, a man who kind of led her out of that and helped her kind of, what she said, fix herself. And then she got an ijazah. And in 1994, she became what they call the mother of the university students in Dakar. So she's kind of the spiritual leader of all the university students who are part of the Faida in Dakar, who started out as a handful. They came to her, and again, this is a story of cooking. I have my chapter on cooking in my book. They came to her and said, can you help us? They're all men, like 5 or 6 men. Young men in the university. They said, we need some help. We're organizing this Mawlid, and we're inviting Sheikh Nadir, who is the same guy I mentioned before. He's a very intellectual son of Sheikh Ibrahim. And I think we're out of time, aren't we? Oops. And they need a meal. You have to have a meal. You can't have a Mawlid without a meal. Can you help us with the meal? She said, okay. So she cooked. She bought the meal. She used her own money. She was a business person at the time. She was buying and selling clothes. 10 more minutes? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So when she presented the meal to Sheikh Nadir, he said, I can see you're taking care of the students well. I'm going to make you the mother of all the students in Dakar. And since then, she's kind of been their spiritual guide. She's actually established this kind of empire of business. She's made a lot of money, but a lot of her money she devotes to building projects, constructing Bainyas's house in Dakar, Sheikh Ibrahim's house in Dakar. So she's just extremely well respected in this community in Dakar. And she has a lot of followers herself. Lots of other examples here. Here's another interesting one. Anybody know who she is? Khadi Fall. She's a university professor. She teaches German. She has 5 post-secondary degrees, university degrees. About the most educated person I've ever met in Western terms. She was a government minister for a year under Abdullah Wad. Very involved in politics, very well known, and she's a muqaddama of Sheikh al-Khairi from Mauritania. So very, very accomplished. But then there are also people who, like Aida Cham on the right, she doesn't have any other job other than being just, working for Sheikh Ibrahim, organizing disciples. She's the one I told the story about taking the meal to Sheikh Ibrahim's sons and being appointed as a muqaddama. Here I'm introducing her to this muqaddama. I said, hey, you should know each other. This is the Mawlid and Taib bin Yasin. I said, hey, you should know her. This is Jani Bagay, the first muqaddama I ever met. Zeni Bombaj. Aida Faye, who's become the big star on the dhikr circuit. Probably the first woman dhikrer to become really, really well known. Not the first one to perform in Mawlids. There have been women before her. Khadi Fall performed before her, but she was the first one to really become a viral star since around 2009, 2010 or so. This is her in a big Mawlid in 2010 or 2014. So, okay, well, we're out of time, so I'd like to open it up for questions. I'm sure you have more questions than I can possibly answer, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Anybody have questions? Don't be shy. I know you have questions. Yes, hi.
You mentioned about one particular woman, Fatima. She's obviously got business, but how are the rest of the institutes funded, and how are they kind of where does the financial kind of aid come from?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good question. Usually, most of these leaders, they don't have any dedicated meeting space. They just meet within their own homes, which is why this one, Aida Cham, she's always talking about how she wants to buy her own house. She hasn't been able to buy a house, but she's renting a place that's big enough for her daira or her group of disciples to meet in. But they pretty much are self-funded. So every week when they have a daira meeting, they have what they call a dhikr. They get together for dhikr, and they all everyone contributes like $1.50 or something, depending on how their abilities. When they have a big event, like everybody, usually each one of these groups organizes some kind of molid every year. Each person will pay 5,000 francs, which is like $10 or something like that. And not everybody can and does pay, but they do. But so it's pretty much self-funded. And when they can, disciples will bring them, pocket change that they have. So some of these women, they get some what they call hadiyah. They get some contributions from their disciples. Although most of them, when they get hadiyah, they'll turn and they'll use that hadiyah they'll give it to the sons of Sheikh Ibrahim for the mosque construction or for their hadiyah or whatever. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's pretty much self-funded. Oh, and some of them are starting economic activities. Like some of them, Awasise, she told me several of them told me they were starting chicken coops. They were raising money from their disciples to start a chicken coop. The profit of selling chickens would go to the daira. They were starting microcredit projects. They were starting all kinds of things. So yeah, all different ways. But the typical way is just to have each person pay 50 cents or $1 every week, and they do it within their own homes, so they're not renting anything.
Are they also like faqihas, like the jurisprudence sides of things? Or
Not really.
more on the spiritual?
Yeah. So the question is, are they faqihas too? Are they giving legal opinions? Not in a formal sense.
Is there
I
a
think if
platform for that?
what's that?
Is that a group as a platform, or is that not something you wish to do?
Nobody has ever really talked about. I've never heard of women really formally doing that in Senegal, and I've never heard of them saying we need to do that. Like, they're usually. Usually people aren't going off to faqihs and saying, "What do I do here? Will you give me a fatwa?" Usually they're just going to their sheikh and they're asking them for their opinion. So they do deliver opinions to their disciples in a sense. I mean, if their disciple says, "Hey, I need some advice. What should I do?" They will give their disciples advice, but they're not calling it, they're not calling it a fatwa, or they're not calling it doing fiqh or acting as a faqih. So they don't really have these institutions in Senegal where you got a faqih sitting there. Like usually it's a sheikh who's well known and who's well studied in fiqh who will deliver opinions. But if she knows the answer, she'll tell them, and if she doesn't, she'll call her sheikh and have him tell her. So it's a much more informal system than that.
Not very receptive to what the teacher says, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. They're pretty receptive of what the teacher says, yeah. And yeah, most of the time, if their sheikh tells them not to do something, they don't do it. They obey. And sometimes it's based on an actual fiqh question. Sometimes it's based on just I feel that that's not the proper course of action. But usually the sheikhs are very supportive of their disciples. They're not going to tell them don't take that job or whatever. There's another question right here.
I just wondered, do you feel like their structures are more or less effective than other matriarchal structures you've seen? And why?
I don't know. I haven't really compared it to other matriarchal structures. I mean, as far as I can tell, I mean, I think these women are pretty, people who don't know them sometimes say, well, they couldn't be very effective because they haven't studied and they're not learned and all that. From my experience, given what they're trying to do, I think they're very effective. Because their job right now, their job is to be in an urban environment where sometimes kids don't have a lot of guidance. And most of their disciples are young kids. Some of their disciples are old people. Like Haja Musokoro Mbaye, this one right here. She gave tarbiyah to her mother when her mother was like in her 70s or maybe around 80. And then she gave her mother an ijazah, and her mother is now a Muqaddama. And her mother is an amazing kind of clairvoyant. She has all kinds of dreams and really like a pretty amazing person. But I think considering what they're asked to do, I'm not going to compare them to anybody else because I can't really think of a very comparable example, but they're pretty effective at what they do. They take these young men and women who are sometimes without a lot of guidance. Some of them are bandits and druggies and who knows. And they clean them up and they say, don't smoke, stop smoking. Like they'll take the cigarette out of their mouth and say, stop smoking. They're not allowed to smoke. They'll say, dress properly, come every Friday for prayer, and then they're pretty effective. And the people who are beyond salvation, I guess they go away. People who can't, they describe the tarbiyah process as very effective in transforming people and getting them to re-examine themselves. Because the point of tarbiyah is really to re-examine yourself and to look at your life and say, how can I improve my life? And so they insist. And from what I can tell from people who are still active in the movement, who knows who have come and, gotten mad and left or whatever, but the people who are still there, they tend to be very, very committed, and their lives tend to be in very good order. So it seems to me that the social consequences of these women is pretty good, and I would say that they're at least as effective as men as acting as spiritual guides, because sometimes disciples are afraid to talk to men about things, but they're not so much afraid to talk to the women. Is this thing still running? Do you know? Okay, thanks. And they can talk to them about very, personal details that they might not talk to a man about. They might be afraid to talk to a man about. So my assessment is they're pretty effective. Other questions? Yeah.
Do they have any feminist concerns, like they are doing this in sake of women empowerment or self-improvement?
Yeah, this is a good question. This is one of the things that I talk about this a little in my book, because I think a lot of people in the West would look at them. I was just talking to Sakina about this, about how people in the West might look at this and say, yeah, they're, these are feminists, they're women empowering. Most liberal feminists will probably look at them and say, oh, I'm not really comfortable with that because they're still wearing a headscarf. They're still, they're still not talking about feminism. I mean, I think they're feminist in a sense. I mean, it depends on how you define feminist. Most of them, if you call them feminists, they say, no, I'm not a feminist, because feminism has become a dirty word for many people. They see it as a Western conspiracy to destroy Islam. But if by feminism you mean that, making sure that women are treated with respect and given options in life to fulfill themselves, then yeah, I think every Muslim since the Prophet ﷺ is or should be a feminist. So, but definitely not in the Western sense. Like they do actually talk about women's liberation. They do talk about women's empowerment. But always in kind of their own way. Everything is kind of embedded within the religious mission. So I think they would identify a little bit with feminist concerns, but not. They'd be very careful about jumping on a feminist bandwagon. And one thing that really distinguishes themselves is they don't see themselves as fighting against some kind of patriarchy. They see themselves as their authority comes from men. It goes back to Sheikh Ibrahim. They don't see themselves as taking something away from the boys. They see themselves as discovering their God-given talents and abilities and realizing them to their full potential. So it's not they don't see it as a zero-sum game. Like, give us more of that. It's more like, here's the power that we've been given as women. We've been given power to be mothers, to be connected to the home in ways that, culturally they're very connected to the home. And they use that, and they find power that maybe hadn't been seen before in those things. So they're realizing women's objectives in ways that are very different from what you would Simone de Beauvoir or somebody like that would expect them to. Was there another? There's another. Somebody back here had a question. Okay, yeah.
How do the men see them then?
Fine. I mean, every once in a while, I'll hear a man kind of write them off. Oh, what do they know? They haven't been to, they haven't memorized all the books of fiqh. But when you say, yeah, but she's a muqaddama of Maki Ibrahim Nias, or she's a muqaddama of this or that, then people kind of have to go, okay, well, why did if he's a person I respect, then why would he have given her a ijazah? So they're not just like unilaterally saying, hey, I'm a leader. They're respected by their communities, and partly because they're respected by their communities, the leadership says, hey, she's an effective leader, let's give her this appointment. So I haven't heard any major leader, and even members of the community, and people who I thought would say, oh yeah, they're what do they know? Very seldom do I hear things like this. And especially nobody says it openly in a way that would actually put them down. Somebody privately might say, yeah, I don't know if she really knows as much as people say she knows. But they say the same thing about the male Muqaddams too. There's no difference. People always, Sheikh this or that, what does he know? He has so many disciples and they think he's so great, but, is he really as great as it? So I don't hear any more of that about the women than I do about the men. For me, I think gender is obviously, like I said, it shapes how they exercise authority, but it's not a limitation on how they exercise authority, from what I can tell.
There's probably a broad question, and you probably answered it kind of earlier on. But what kind of inspired you to kind of venture into this research, and what's your goal, so to speak?
Yeah, this is a that could take a very long answer or a very short answer, but I'll give you a short answer because we don't have very much time. Mostly it was from an academic perspective. I was there studying this and I met all these women, and I came back and I looked at the academic literature. I said, I want to double check and make sure that I've missed something. Has anybody ever talked about this? And I looked through all the literature, the academic literature, and found that nobody had talked about this. there have been a couple like exceptional cases of women leaders who were like the daughters of somebody who had died without leaving any sons or something. Nobody had talked about cases like this, so I said this is about the most unique part of my research, so I think if I don't publish this it would be irresponsible. I had no personal interest in studying gender and women and all that when I started my research. It was not even on my radar. But it was just because I saw that nobody had talked about it. Kind of same with my current research on hip-hop and Sufism. I hadn't seen many people writing about that. I'm not really a hip-hop head myself. Sorry to all the hip-hop heads in the room. I'm not, that's not my primary interest anyway. But I just saw in Senegal, most of the major hip-hop artists are members of this group. And I said, wait, what? So many Muslims think that's haram. How is it that they are very committed, very serious Muslims, very serious Sufis, and they're doing this thing, and nobody seems to oppose them. So it's kind of the same thing. It was just like, wow, this is really interesting. Maybe people should hear about that. So, and here I happen to have people here who sort of cross both of those, check both of those boxes, who are powerful Sufi women and hip hop artists at the same time. So that's kind of nice. So yeah, so that's essentially it. Not really my personal, like I was in some kind of gender crusade myself, or jihad, if you want to call it that.
I just have one last question. I know that you mentioned earlier. Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you spoke Wolof. So how long did it take you to actually learn it?
Depends on how fluently you want to go by, but I became pretty comfortable in I was there for 6 years in 6 months in 1998, and I was speaking mostly French, so by the end I was not that comfortable. But when I went back for 3 more months and just stayed with Wolof speakers in 2001, I became pretty comfortable, and over the years it's become easier. So yeah, I don't think you just have to immerse yourself, that's all. I never took any Wolof classes or anything. I just wrote down when people said something I didn't know, I just wrote it down. So yeah, you just gotta immerse yourself. I think that I would say any more questions, but I think we gotta wrap it up. So thank you everybody for coming. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all and for your questions. If you have other questions afterwards, feel free to ask. So sorry we started late. We could have had more questions otherwise.
Just like everybody for coming today. And just to know that the link to Professor Joseph Hill's work has been posted on the page, on the Facebook page, right? So you can go there and you can download a lot of his work, inshallah. So if you go on the Facebook, and you can actually download some of his work. And also tomorrow, those of you that are interested, he will be doing another talk after the dhikr, which is going to happen in the Ethiopian Center tomorrow, inshallah. So he'll be there. And also, inshallah, after today, after we open for iftar, we're going to have some dhikr as well. So hopefully you'll stay, inshallah, you can take part in some dhikr. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. I think we're about 1 minute or something.
Yes, now.
Yeah? Adhan? Is it 1 minute? 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes.
Time. For those of you who are here at Rumi's Cave for the first time, we're going to have the opening of the fast. So we're going to have some dates and food and some water. And then after that we're going to pray, and then we're going to have some food. So if you can, please stay and join us. And that would be really nice. And this happens every day. So there's a talk every day at Rumi's Cave between 8 and 9. And there's the opening of the fast, and you're all welcome.
19.
He thought you did this.